Martha Williams sat quietly in her favorite armchair, the same one she had owned for 30 years. At 72 years old, she moved slowly but still maintained her small garden and kept her house spotless. The afternoon sun streamed through her lace curtains as she watched her soap opera, a cup of lukewarm tea growing cold on the side table next to her. The neighborhood had changed over the decades. Young families had moved in, and Martha enjoyed watching the children play in the street from her front window. She had lived in this house since 1975, raising 3 children here after her husband died young. Now, only her youngest son, David, visited regularly, bringing groceries and checking on her every few days. Martha's routine was simple and peaceful. She woke early, tended to her small vegetable garden behind the house, prepared simple meals, and spent evenings reading or watching television. Her arthritis made some tasks difficult, but she managed well enough on her own. The neighbors knew her as a kind woman who always had a smile and occasionally shared vegetables from her garden. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, Martha was dozing lightly in her chair when a sharp knock came at her front door. She stirred, awake, confused for a moment about the time. The knocking continued, more insistent now. Martha slowly pushed herself up from her chair, her joints protesting after sitting still for so long. She shuffled to the front door in her house slippers, one hand holding onto furniture for support. Through the peephole, she could see a uniformed police officer standing on her small front porch. Martha felt a flutter of worry in her chest. In all her years in this neighborhood, police had never come to her door. With her arthritic fingers, she struggled to turn the deadbolt. The officer knocked again, harder this time. Martha called out that she was coming, her voice shaky with nervousness. Finally, she managed to open the door, leaving the security chain attached. Through the small gap, she looked up at Officer Reynolds, a tall man in his 30s with cold eyes and an impatient expression. He wore the standard uniform of the city. Police department, complete with radio, nightstick, and gun at his side. "Ma'am, I need to come inside and search your premises," Officer Reynolds announced without any greeting or explanation. Martha blinked in confusion. "I'm sorry, officer, but why? Is there some problem?" "We received reports of suspicious activity at this address. I need to conduct a search immediately." The elderly woman's mind raced. She had been home all day, had not left except to water her garden that morning. No one had visited. No deliveries had been made. She could not imagine what suspicious activity anyone could have reported. "Officer, I think there might be some mistake. I've been home all day, and nothing unusual has happened here." Officer Reynolds shifted his weight, his hand moving to rest on his nightstick. "Ma'am, you need to let me inside right now. This is official police business." Martha felt intimidated by his aggressive tone, but something inside her resisted. Her late husband had always taught her to know her rights. "Officer, don't you need a warrant to search someone's home?" The question seemed to anger Reynolds. His jaw tightened and his voice became harder. "Lady, I don't have time for this. Open this door now, or you'll be arrested for obstruction of justice." Martha's hands trembled as she held onto the door. She had never been in trouble with the law in her entire life. The thought of being arrested terrified her. But she also felt that something was not right about this situation. "Please, officer, can you tell me exactly what kind of suspicious activity was reported? Maybe I can help clear up any misunderstanding without you needing to search my house." Reynolds took a step closer to the door, his bulk filling the small opening. "Ma'am, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. I'm going to count to 3, and if you don't open this door completely, I'm going to charge you with interfering, with a police investigation." The fear in Martha's voice was clear as she spoke. "Officer, I'm not trying to interfere with anything. I'm just an old woman trying to understand what's happening." 1, Reynolds began counting, his hand now gripping his nightstick. Martha's heart pounded in her chest. She had watched enough news to know that situations like this could escalate quickly. But she also felt strongly that she had done nothing wrong and that the officer's behavior was inappropriate. 2, Reynolds continued, his voice now threatening. Martha made a decision that would change everything. Instead of opening the door wider, she began to close it, intending to call her son David for advice. She had his number memorized and kept her old rotary phone on the kitchen counter. But Officer Reynolds had other plans. As soon as he saw the door beginning to close, he put his shoulder against it and pushed hard. The security chain snapped under the pressure, and the door flew open so violently that Martha was knocked backward. She stumbled, her house slippers providing no grip on the smooth hardwood floor. Martha fell hard, her hip hitting the ground first, followed by her shoulder and head. Pain shot through her entire body as she lay there, stunned and frightened. Officer Reynolds stepped into her house without invitation, closing the door behind him. He looked down at the elderly woman on the floor with no apparent concern for her condition. "Now look what you made me do," he said coldly. "If you had just cooperated from the beginning, none of this would have happened." Martha lay on her living room floor, pain radiating through her hip and shoulder. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook with the effort. "Officer, please help me up. I think I might be hurt." Instead of helping, Reynolds walked past her into the living room, beginning to look around. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Where is what?" Martha asked from the floor, genuine confusion in her voice. "Don't play games with me, lady. We know you're hiding something here." Martha managed to prop herself up on one elbow, though the movement caused sharp pain in her hip. "Officer, I promise you, I have no idea what you're looking for. Please, can you help me get to my chair?" Reynolds ignored her request and continued his unauthorized search, opening drawers and moving items around carelessly. Martha's neat, organized home was being turned upside down by this stranger who had forced his way inside. As she lay there watching the destruction of her peaceful space, Martha realized she was experiencing something she had only read about in newspapers. This was what people meant when they talked about police overreach and abuse of power. She had never imagined it would happen to her. Officer Reynolds moved through Martha's living room like a tornado, pulling books from shelves and dumping out the contents of small decorative boxes. Martha watched helplessly from the floor, still unable to get up due to the pain in her hip. Every movement she attempted sent sharp jolts through her body. "Officer, please tell me what you're looking for," Martha pleaded again, her voice weaker now. "Maybe I can help you find it so you don't have to tear apart my home." Reynolds stopped his searching and turned to look down at her with obvious irritation. "You know exactly what I'm looking for, so stop pretending to be innocent." "I truly don't know," Martha insisted. "I'm just an old woman who lives alone. I don't have anything that would interest the police." The officer's expression grew darker. He walked over to where Martha lay and stood directly above her, his large frame casting a shadow over her small form. "Maybe you need some encouragement. To tell the truth." Fear crept into Martha's voice. "Officer, I am telling the truth. Please, I need medical attention. My hip is really hurting and I can't get up." Instead of showing any concern for her injury, Reynolds crouched down next to her. "Listen, old lady, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." Martha felt genuine terror now. This was not how police officers were supposed to behave. She had always trusted law enforcement, always taught her children to respect and cooperate with police. But this man seemed dangerous, and she was completely helpless. "Officer, I need you to call an ambulance," Martha said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think my hip might be broken." Reynolds laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Nice try. You're not getting out of this that easy." He stood up and resumed his search, now moving into Martha's kitchen. She could hear him opening cabinets and slamming them shut, the sound of dishes rattling and items being thrown around. Her neat, organized kitchen was being destroyed. From her position on the floor, Martha could see Reynolds pulling everything out of her refrigerator, looking behind items and checking inside containers. He opened her flour canister and dumped its contents onto the counter. White powder covered everything. "Officer Reynolds?" Martha tried using his name, having read it from his badge. "Whatever you're looking for, it's not here. I promise you." "Shut up," he snapped from the kitchen. "I'll tell you when to talk." Martha closed her eyes and tried to think. She needed help, but her phone was in the kitchen where Reynolds was conducting his destructive search. She had no way to contact anyone. Her nearest neighbor was Mrs. Chen, but the walls were thick, and she doubted anyone could hear what was happening inside. When Reynolds returned to the living room, his uniform was dusty from the flour, and his frustration was obvious. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, his eyes stopping on Martha's antique china cabinet. "No, please," Martha whispered as she realized his intention. Reynolds walked to the cabinet and began pulling out dishes that had belonged to Martha's grandmother. These were her most precious possessions, items she had carefully preserved for decades. He examined each piece briefly before either setting it down roughly or simply dropping it. The sound of breaking china filled the room as several pieces shattered on the hardwood floor. Martha felt tears running down her cheeks as she watched. Generations of family heirlooms being destroyed by this man's careless hands. "Stop! Please stop!" she begged. "Those belong to my grandmother. They're all I have left of her." Reynolds paused and looked at her with what appeared to be satisfaction at her distress. "Then maybe you should start talking." "I don't know what you want me to say," Martha sobbed. "I've told you everything. There's nothing here." The officer's radio crackled to life, and a dispatcher's voice filled the room. Reynolds reached for the device on his shoulder and turned down the volume, but not before Martha heard something about a different address several blocks away. She felt a spark of hope. Maybe this was all a terrible mistake. Maybe he was supposed to be somewhere else entirely. "Officer," she said carefully, "did you check the address? Maybe you're supposed to be at a different house." The question seemed to enrage Reynolds. He walked back over to Martha and grabbed her arm roughly, causing her to cry out in pain. "Are you telling me how to do my job?" he demanded, his grip tightening. "No, no," Martha gasped. "I just thought maybe there was a mix-up." Reynolds released her arm so suddenly that she fell back against the floor. The impact sent fresh waves of pain through her injured hip. "There's no mix-up," he said coldly. "We've been watching this house for weeks." This statement confused Martha even more. If police had been watching her house, they would have seen that nothing suspicious ever happened here. Her days were routine and peaceful. The most exciting thing that occurred was when the mailman stopped to chat about the weather. "Watching for what?" she asked. "Drug activity," Reynolds said bluntly. Martha stared at him in complete shock. "Drugs? Officer, I take blood pressure medication and vitamins. That's all. I don't even drink alcohol." "Right," Reynolds said sarcastically. "A sweet little old lady like you couldn't possibly be involved in anything illegal." The absurdity of the situation was almost overwhelming. Martha had never even seen illegal drugs, let alone been involved with them. She barely left her house except for doctor appointments and grocery shopping with David. Reynolds moved to her bedroom, and Martha could hear him tearing apart her closet and dumping out dresser drawers. The sound of her clothes being thrown around mixed with the crash of items falling to the floor. When he returned to the living room, Reynolds looked even more frustrated. His search had turned up nothing because there was nothing to find. But instead of acknowledging his mistake, his anger seemed to be growing. "Where are you hiding it?" he demanded, standing over Martha again. "I'm not hiding anything," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. Reynolds reached down and grabbed Martha's wrist, twisting it painfully. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not lying," Martha gasped, trying to pull her arm away from his grip. The officer's radio crackled again, and this time a supervisor's voice came through asking for his location and status. Reynolds released Martha's wrist and stepped away to respond, but Martha could tell he was giving vague answers about his whereabouts. As she lay there listening to his radio conversation, Martha realized that Officer Reynolds might not be conducting. an official search at all. The pieces were starting to come together in her frightened mind, and the picture they formed was terrifying. Martha's realization that something was deeply wrong with this situation gave her a strange kind of clarity, despite her pain and fear. Officer Reynolds was now in her bathroom, and she could hear him throwing items around, probably searching, through her medicine cabinet and linen closet. She tried once more to push herself up from the floor, but her hip would not support her weight. The pain was getting worse, and she was beginning to feel dizzy. Martha suspected she might have a serious injury, but Reynolds had made it clear he had no intention of getting her medical help. When Reynolds returned from the bathroom, his face was red with anger and frustration. His uniform was disheveled, and his hair was messy from his frantic searching. He looked down at Martha with undisguised hostility. "Okay, lady, I'm done playing games with you," he said, his voice low and threatening. "I know there are drugs in this house somewhere, and you're going to tell me where they are." Martha looked up at him with as much dignity as she could manage while lying injured on her floor. "Officer Reynolds, I have lived in this house for almost 50 years. I have never owned, used, or sold any illegal drugs. If you truly believe there are drugs here, then someone has given you very wrong information." "Are you calling me a liar?" Reynolds demanded, his hand moving to his nightstick again. "No, sir. I'm suggesting that maybe someone made a mistake or gave you false information." Reynolds pulled his nightstick from his belt and held it in a way that made it clear he was considering using it. Martha's fear spiked to a new level. She was a defenseless elderly woman, alone and injured, at the mercy of an officer who seemed to have lost all professional control. "Officer, please don't hurt me," she whispered. "I'm telling you the truth." "The truth?" Reynolds laughed bitterly. "The truth is that your neighborhood is full of drug dealers, and old ladies like you are perfect covers for their operations. Nobody suspects the sweet grandmother." Martha felt a flash of indignation despite her fear. "How dare you make such assumptions about me? You don't know anything about me or my life." The response seemed to surprise Reynolds. Perhaps he expected her to continue cowering, but Martha Williams had not survived 72 years by backing. Down from bullies, even when they wore badges. "I know plenty," Reynolds said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know that dealers use places like this to store their drugs." "Then you know wrong," Martha said firmly. "And if you were conducting a proper investigation, you would have realized that by now." Reynolds raised his nightstick slightly, and Martha flinched. But before he could do anything, the sound of a car pulling into her driveway came through the front window. Both Martha and Reynolds froze, listening. Car doors slammed, and footsteps approached the front door. Martha felt a surge of hope, praying. It might be David, or even a neighbor who had noticed something wrong. A knock came at the door, followed by a familiar voice calling, "Mom? Are you okay in there? Your door is standing wide open." It was David. Martha had never been so happy to hear her son's voice in her entire life. Reynolds immediately moved toward Martha and pointed his nightstick at her. "You call out to him, and both of you will regret it," he whispered harshly. "Mom!" David's voice came again, closer now. He was apparently stepping into the house. "What happened to your door? The frame is all splintered." Martha looked up at Reynolds, torn between fear for herself and fear for her son. Reynolds was clearly unstable, and she had no idea how he might react to David's presence. "I'm in the living room, David," she called out, her voice shaking. "There's been some trouble." David appeared in the doorway to the living room and stopped, dead when he saw the scene before him. His elderly mother was lying on the floor, obviously injured and distressed. A police officer stood over her holding a nightstick. The room was in complete disarray, with broken china and scattered belongings everywhere. "What the hell is going on here?" David demanded, immediately moving toward his mother. Reynolds stepped between them, blocking David's path. "Sir, you need to stay back. This is a police matter." David was 45 years old, worked as an electrician, and had inherited his mother's strong will. He was not easily intimidated. Police matter? Why is my mother on the floor? Why does it look like someone ransacked her house? Your mother was resisting a lawful search, Reynolds said, but Martha could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice now that he had to face another adult. Resisting? David looked from Reynolds to his mother. She's 72 years old and weighs about 100 pounds. What kind of resistance could she possibly offer that would justify this? Martha tried to sit up again, and this time David immediately knelt beside her to help. Mom, are you hurt? Do you need an ambulance? My hip, Martha said weakly. I think it might be broken. He pushed the door open and knocked me down. David's expression darkened as he looked up at Reynolds. You knocked down my elderly mother? She was interfering with a police investigation, Reynolds said, but he was backing up slightly. What investigation? David demanded, his voice rising. What possible crime could my mother have committed? Reynolds seemed to be realizing that his story was falling apart. He had expected to deal with only a frightened old woman, not her son, who was asking pointed questions and clearly not intimidated by his uniform. We received reports of drug activity at this address, Reynolds said, sticking to his story. David looked around the destroyed living room and then back at Reynolds with obvious disbelief. Drug activity? You think my mother is selling drugs? Stranger things have happened, Reynolds said weakly. No, David said firmly, standing up to face the officer directly. Not really. My mother is a retired school secretary who spends her days gardening and reading. The strongest thing in her medicine cabinet is aspirin. Martha watched the confrontation between her son and the officer with mixed emotions. She was grateful for David's protection, but she was also terrified that Reynolds might escalate the situation and hurt him too. David, she said softly, maybe you should call for backup or speak to his supervisor. Reynolds stepped closer to David. Nobody is calling anybody. This is my investigation, and I'm handling it. David pulled out his cell phone. Actually, I think we need to get some other officers here to sort this out. Reynolds reached for his gun. The moment Officer Reynolds reached for his gun, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. David immediately put his hands up, his cell phone still clutched in one hand, while Martha let out a small cry of terror from where she lay on the floor. Whoa, officer, David said carefully, his voice steady despite the obvious danger. There's no need for weapons here. Let's just talk about this calmly. Reynolds had his hand on his gun, but had not drawn it yet. Martha could see the sweat beading on his forehead and the wild look in his eyes. This was a man who had lost control of the situation and was now dangerous in his desperation. Put the phone down, Reynolds ordered, his voice tight with tension. David slowly placed his phone on the coffee table, never taking his eyes off the officer. Okay, it's down. Now can you please tell me what this is really about? Martha watched the standoff between her son and the increasingly unstable officer. She realized that Reynolds was not just corrupt or overly aggressive. He was scared. Something about his behavior suggested that this was not a sanctioned police action at all. Officer Reynolds, Martha said from the floor, her voice as calm as she could make it. Why don't you call your supervisor right now? Have them come here and sort this out. If this is a legitimate investigation, they'll back you up. The suggestion seemed to panic Reynolds. His hand tightened on his gun and he looked toward the door as if considering his options. I don't need my supervisor, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. David seemed to pick up on the same thing Martha had noticed. Actually, officer, that's a great idea. Why don't we call your department right now and get someone down here to witness whatever you think you're going to find? No, Reynolds said sharply. This is my investigation and I'll handle it my way. Martha and David exchanged a look. They were both beginning to understand that Officer Reynolds was not conducting an official investigation at all. The question was why he was really here and what he hoped to accomplish. Officer, David said carefully, I'm going to be honest with you. This doesn't seem like standard police procedure to me. Breaking into someone's home without a warrant, knocking down an elderly woman, refusing to call for backup. None of this seems right. Reynolds was now sweating heavily. His uniform was disheveled, and his behavior was becoming more erratic by the minute. Martha realized that he might be under the influence of something himself. "You don't know what you're talking about," Reynolds said, his words slightly slurred. "I'm a police officer, and I have authority here." David noticed the slurred speech, too. "Officer, are you feeling all right? Maybe you should sit down for a minute." "Don't tell me what to do," Reynolds snapped, pulling his gun partially from its holster. Martha felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might stop. Her son was in mortal danger because of her, and she was helpless to protect him. "David," she whispered, "maybe you should leave and get help." "I'm not leaving you, Mom," David said firmly, still keeping his eyes on Reynolds. The officer seemed to be having some kind of internal struggle. He kept looking toward the door, then back at David and Martha, as if he couldn't decide what to do next. His original plan, whatever it had been, was clearly falling apart. "You know what I think?" David said, his voice conversational, despite the gun pointed in his direction. "I think you're not here on police business at all. I think you picked my mother's house for some other reason, and now you don't know how to get out of this situation." Reynolds' reaction confirmed David's suspicion. The officer's face went pale, and his gun hand began to shake slightly. "You're wrong," Reynolds said, but there was no force behind his words. "Am I?" David pressed. "Because if this was official, police business, you would have called for backup the moment I arrived. You would have been happy to have witnesses to prove that you were conducting a legitimate search." Martha watched as her son skillfully maneuvered the conversation, trying to de-escalate the situation while also gathering information. She had always been proud of David's intelligence, but she had never seen him handle such a dangerous situation before. "Maybe," David continued, "you thought you could scare an elderly woman into giving you something. Money, valuables, something you could steal and make it look like part of a drug bust." Reynolds' expression confirmed that David had hit close to the truth. The officer's story about drug activity had never made sense, but the idea that he was attempting to rob Martha under the cover of his uniform explained everything. "That's not," Reynolds started to say, but his words trailed off. "It's okay," David said gently. "We can work this out. Nobody has to get hurt here. You haven't actually hurt my mother seriously, and nothing valuable has been taken. You can just walk away from this." Martha admired her son's attempt to give Reynolds an easy way out, but she could see that the officer was too far gone to accept it. His eyes had the look of a cornered animal, and she feared what he might do in his desperation. Reynolds raised his gun higher, pointing it directly at David's chest. "Nobody is walking away from anything. You two have seen too much." The threat hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. Martha realized that Reynolds had just admitted that this was not a legitimate police action and that he was now considering silencing the witnesses to his crime. "Officer," Martha said, her voice stronger than she felt. "You're a police officer. Whatever problems you might have, whatever brought you here, you don't want to add murder to your troubles." "Shut up," Reynolds said, but his voice was shaking now. David remained perfectly still, his hands still raised. "She's right, Officer Reynolds. Think about what you're doing. You have a family, don't you? People who care about you?" The mention of family seemed to strike a nerve. Reynolds' expression flickered for a moment, showing something that might have been regret or pain. "You don't know anything about my family," he said bitterly. "Maybe not," David agreed, "but I know they wouldn't want you to throw your life away like this." Martha could see that her son was trying to connect with whatever humanity was left in Reynolds, but she could also see that the officer was becoming more unstable by the minute. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and the gun in his hand was wavering dangerously. Suddenly, the sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer. Someone had apparently called the police, possibly a neighbor who had noticed the disturbance. Reynolds's head snapped toward the window, and his face went white with panic. The sirens were definitely getting closer, and Martha felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Help was coming, but Reynolds was now completely cornered, and she had no idea how he would react. The approaching sirens sent Officer Reynolds into a state of complete panic. He began pacing back and forth in Martha's living room, his gun still drawn, muttering to himself in words that neither Martha nor David could clearly understand. "This wasn't supposed to happen," Reynolds kept repeating, sweat now pouring down his face. "This wasn't supposed to happen." David remained perfectly still, his hands raised, trying to assess whether he could safely move to protect his mother or disarm the increasingly unstable officer. Martha lay on the floor, her hip throbbing with pain, watching the scene unfold with growing terror. The sirens were getting closer, and Reynolds seemed to be having some kind of breakdown. He kept looking between the front door and the back of the house, as if trying to figure out an escape route. "Officer Reynolds," David said softly, "those sirens might not even be for us. Could be a fire truck or an ambulance heading somewhere else." But Reynolds wasn't listening to reason anymore. His eyes had taken on a wild, desperate look, and Martha could see that he was beyond rational thought. "They're coming for me," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to find out what I did." David exchanged a quick glance with his mother. Reynolds was clearly admitting to something, but they still didn't know the full extent of what he had been planning or what other crimes he might have committed. The sirens were now very close, and suddenly they stopped. Martha heard car doors slamming outside and the sound of heavy footsteps on her front walkway. Relief flooded through her body as she realized that help had actually arrived. "Police! Open up!" came a commanding voice from outside. Reynolds spun toward the door, his gun shaking in his hand. "No, no, no," he muttered. "This ruins everything." "Officer Reynolds," came the voice from outside again. "We know you're in there. We need to talk." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. The officers outside knew Reynolds by name, which meant they had come specifically looking for him. This suggested that his problems were even bigger than she had imagined. "They know," Reynolds said, his voice filled with despair. "They know what I've been doing." David saw an opportunity in Reynolds's distraction. "What have you been doing, officer? Maybe if you surrender now and explain everything, they'll go easier on you." Reynolds laughed bitterly. "Easier? I've been stealing from evidence lockers for months, selling drugs that were supposed to be destroyed, using my uniform to rob people like your mother when I needed quick cash." Martha gasped despite her pain. Reynolds had just confessed to being a corrupt officer who had been using his position to commit multiple crimes. Her house had apparently been chosen at random because he thought an elderly woman living alone would be an easy target. "Officer Reynolds," the voice outside called again, "we have the house surrounded. There's no way out. Let's resolve this peacefully." Reynolds seemed to collapse inward at these words. He sat heavily in Martha's favorite armchair, the gun still in his hand but no longer pointed at David or Martha. "My wife," Reynolds said quietly. "She doesn't know. My kids don't know what their father really is." David slowly lowered his hands, sensing that the immediate danger had passed. "It doesn't have to end badly, officer. If you put down your weapon and surrender now, you can get help. Your family will still love you." "You don't understand," Reynolds said, shaking his head. "I owe money to people who don't forgive debts. I've been stealing to pay them back, but it's never enough." Martha began to understand the full scope of Reynolds' situation. He was a police officer who had gotten involved with criminals, probably through gambling or drugs, and had been desperately trying to pay them back by stealing and robbing innocent people. "Officer Reynolds," she said gently from her position on the floor, "I'm hurt, and I need medical attention. If you surrender now, they'll call an ambulance for me, and nobody else has to get hurt today." Reynolds looked at her as if seeing her, clearly for the first time. Martha could see a flicker of the decent person he might have been before his life spiraled out of control. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. "I just needed money, and I thought you might have some jewelry or cash hidden away." "I know," Martha said, her voice kind despite everything he had put her through. "But this isn't who you really are, is it?" Outside, the voice called again. "Reynolds, we know about the evidence room thefts. We know about the protection money. We can work something out, but you need to come out now." Reynolds stood up slowly, looking around Martha's destroyed living room with what appeared to be genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," he said to both Martha and David. "I'm sorry for all of this." David nodded. "We know you are, officer. Now please put down your gun and let us get my mother some medical help." Reynolds looked at the gun in his hand as if he had forgotten he was holding it. Then, in a moment that surprised everyone, he carefully placed it on Martha's coffee table and stepped away from it. "I'm coming out," he called toward the front door. "My weapon is down. There are 2 civilians in here who need help." The front door burst open, and several police officers in tactical gear flooded into the house. They quickly secured Reynolds, who offered no resistance, and immediately called for paramedics when they saw Martha's condition. Detective Sarah Chen, who appeared to be in charge, knelt beside Martha while the paramedics worked. "Ma'am, I'm Detective Chen. Can you tell me what happened here?" Martha looked up at the detective, a middle-aged Asian woman with kind eyes and a professional demeanor that was completely different from Reynolds's threatening presence. "Officer Reynolds forced his way into my home," Martha said weakly. "He said he was looking for drugs, but there are no drugs here. He knocked me down and searched my house. I think he was trying to rob me." Detective Chen nodded grimly. "We've been investigating Officer Reynolds for several weeks. We received a tip that he was conducting unauthorized searches in this neighborhood. I'm so sorry this happened to you." As the paramedics carefully moved Martha onto a stretcher, she felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over her. The ordeal was finally over, but the physical and emotional trauma would take time to heal. David walked alongside the stretcher as they prepared to take his mother to the hospital. "Mom, everything's going to be okay now," he said, holding her hand gently. Detective Chen approached them before they left. "Mrs. Williams, I know this has been a terrible experience for you, but would you be willing to give us a full statement once you've been treated at the hospital? Your testimony will be crucial in making sure Officer Reynolds faces justice for what he's done." Martha nodded weakly. "Of course, Detective. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." As they wheeled her toward the ambulance, Martha caught sight of Reynolds being led to a police car in handcuffs. He looked broken and defeated, no longer the threatening figure who had terrorized her in her own home. She felt a complex mixture of anger and pity for him. "Detective Chen," Martha called out as they reached the ambulance. "Officer Reynolds mentioned owing money to dangerous people. Will his family be safe?" Detective Chen's expression softened at Martha's concern for her attacker's family. "We'll make sure they're protected, Mrs. Williams. You have a good heart to think of them after what you've been through." The paramedics loaded Martha into the ambulance, with David climbing in beside her. As they drove toward the hospital, Martha reflected on how quickly her peaceful afternoon had turned into a nightmare and how her son's arrival had potentially saved both their lives. "David," she said quietly as the ambulance moved through the streets, "I'm proud of how you handled that situation. You were so brave." David squeezed her hand. "I learned from the best, Mom. You stood up to him even when you were hurt and scared." That took real courage. Martha smiled despite her pain. She knew that the physical injuries would heal, and even the emotional trauma would fade with time. But she also knew that this experience had changed her forever. She had seen firsthand how power could be abused, and how quickly a person's sense of safety could be shattered. As the ambulance turned into the hospital parking lot, Martha made a silent promise to herself that she would not let this experience make her bitter or afraid. She would recover, she would testify, and she would continue to live her life with dignity and grace. 3 months later, Martha Williams sat in her living room, which had been completely restored to its former order. The broken china had been replaced through insurance, though she still mourned the loss of her grandmother's original pieces. Her hip had required surgery, but she was walking again with the help of a cane and regular physical therapy. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Officer Reynolds had pled guilty to multiple charges, including home invasion, assault, theft from evidence lockers, and corruption. The investigation had revealed that he had robbed at least 6 other elderly residents in the neighborhood over the past 2 months, always targeting people who lived alone and were unlikely to fight back effectively. Martha had testified at his sentencing hearing, speaking clearly and firmly about the impact his actions had on her life and her sense of security. But she had also asked the judge to consider that Reynolds clearly needed help for his gambling addiction and substance abuse problems, which had led him down this destructive path. Detective Chen had visited Martha several times during her recovery, both to update her on the case and to check on her well-being. The detective had become something of a friend, often stopping by for tea and conversation. "You know, Mrs. Williams," Detective Chen had said during one of her visits, "your case helped us uncover a much larger problem in the department. Reynolds wasn't working alone. He was part of a group of officers who were covering for each other while they committed various crimes." Martha had been shocked to learn that police corruption had reached such levels in her city, but she was gratified to know that her terrible experience had helped expose it and prevent it from happening to others. David now visited his mother every day instead of just a few times a week. The incident had made him realize how vulnerable she was living alone, and he had been working with her to consider her options for the future. "Mom, you don't have to make any decisions right now," he had assured her. "But I want you to know that you're welcome to move in with Sarah and me. The kids would love having their grandmother around more." Martha appreciated the offer, but she wasn't ready to give up her independence. However, she had agreed to some security improvements to her home, including better locks, a security system, and a medical alert device that she wore around her neck. The neighborhood had rallied around Martha after learning about the incident. Mrs. Chen from next door now checked on her daily, and the younger families on the street had made sure she had their phone numbers in case she ever needed anything. Martha had also received an unexpected visit from Reynolds' wife, Patricia, who had come to apologize for her husband's actions. "Mrs. Williams," Patricia had said, tears streaming down her face, "I had no idea what Carl was doing. I knew he was having problems, but I never imagined he would hurt innocent people." Martha had invited her in for tea, and they had talked for over an hour about the warning signs of addiction and the importance of getting help before it was too late. "Your husband isn't a bad person," Martha had told Patricia. "He's a person who made bad choices when he was desperate. There's a difference, and that difference means he can still turn his life around." The conversation had been healing for both women. Patricia was dealing with the shame and guilt of being married to someone who had committed such crimes, while Martha was working through her own feelings of anger and betrayal. On this particular afternoon, as Martha sat reading in her favorite chair, she reflected on how the incident had changed her perspective on many things. She had always believed that police officers were inherently trustworthy, but she now understood that they were human beings capable of the same failings as anyone else. She had also learned about her own strength and resilience. At 72 years old, she had survived a terrifying ordeal and had found the courage to stand up for herself and seek justice. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts, but this time she felt no fear. She looked through the peephole and smiled when she saw David standing on her porch with his 2 children, her grandchildren. "Grandma Martha," 8-year-old Emma called out as Martha opened the door. "We brought you cookies we made at school." And, "I drew you a picture," added 6-year-old Michael, holding up a crayon drawing of what appeared to be Martha's house, surrounded by flowers. Martha hugged both children and invited them in, grateful for their innocent joy and unconditional love. These visits had become more frequent since the incident, and they always lifted her spirits. As the children settled in the living room with milk and the cookies they had brought, David pulled Martha aside. "How are you really doing, Mom?" he asked quietly. "I know you put on a brave face, but I want to know how you're actually feeling." Martha considered the question carefully. "I'm doing well, David. Some days are harder than others, especially when I hear unexpected noises or when someone comes to the door. But I refuse to live in fear." "Have you given any more thought to counseling?" David asked. "Dr. Martinez said it might help you process everything that happened." Martha nodded. "I've been thinking about it. Maybe it would be good to talk to someone who understands trauma." As they rejoined the children in the living room, Martha felt a deep sense of gratitude for her family and her community. The incident with Officer Reynolds had been traumatic and life-changing, but it had also shown her how much support she had in her life. Later that evening, after David and the children had gone home, Martha sat in her garden watching the sunset. Her vegetables were growing well, and she had planted some new flowers that would bloom in the spring. She thought about Officer Reynolds, now serving a 10-year prison sentence, and wondered if he was getting the help he needed to overcome his addictions and rebuild his life. She hoped he was, for the sake of his family and for his own sake. Martha also thought about the other victims of his crimes, elderly people like herself who had been terrorized in their own homes. She had started attending support group meetings for crime victims, finding comfort in sharing her experiences with others who understood what she had been through. As darkness fell, Martha went back inside and locked her door securely behind her. But the fear that might have consumed another person in her situation had been replaced by a quiet determination to continue living fully and without regret. She had survived one of the worst experiences of her life, and in doing so she had discovered reservoirs of strength and courage she never knew she possessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities, and Martha Williams was ready to face them all.